They all go together, those candies. No fighting there. Let's see.
Good.
Some bread from Karen.
Thank
Made
you.
that. Very good. And David Schronis is going to play a tune, and please join in. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Aaron. Happy birthday to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, that's good. Everybody come on over.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
I mentioned to Jonathon that 42 years ago on my bar mitzvah, I wore a brown corduroy suit, which I'm grateful not to have anymore. Yes, thank you. But it was the story, the portion that we're looking at today, Noah, that was the assigned Torah reading for my bar mitzvah week, and that was in October of 1981. Right? You may remember that we read through the Torah, the Jewish communities do sequentially, a few chapters, a Torah portion, we call it, each week, such that at the end of the year, we've gone through the first 5 books. It's just a coincidence that the way in which we've scheduled the Genesis stories for our own study this year coincides with the week on which this story is what's being read around the Jewish world. So it's the first portion I ever prepared, or the first text I ever began to look at. Do you want to say something as we get started?
Sure. Because this particular section is so long, we're not going to read all of it, but please take this. We've got a handout for everybody. It's 2.5 chapters or so to get the whole story. Most of you are familiar with it. Please read it. We're going to read the first page and then approach this as one would do a Torah study, correct?
Right.
Do you all know what doing a Torah study is? You're about to find out very soon. Remember, before we start, what's happened so far in the overall story. God created, there are 2 versions, God created the heavens and the earth, and God said about all the plants and trees and animals and so on, what did God call them? Good. It's good. Then God created people, human beings, Adam, which means Adam and Eve, and said they were very good. And then things start to go off the rails. Adam and Eve choose from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and they are expelled from the garden, and then all sorts of things happen, and then Cain and Abel story where Cain kills his brother Abel out of envy or whatever, and then there's a list of genealogy and some things they started to get rougher, and then abruptly, it feels like, we come to this story. And now let me read we'll read the first page. These are the descendants of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. And Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I'm going to destroy them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits. Each cubit is about 18 inches. Its width, 50 cubits, and its height, 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark and finish it to a cubit above. And put the door of the ark in its side and make it with lower, second, and third decks. For my part, I'm going to bring a flood of waters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all the flesh, in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. And every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, of the birds according to their kinds, and the animals according to their kinds, and of every creeping thing of the ground according to its kind. 2 of every kind shall come into you, to keep them alive. Also take with you every kind of food that is eaten, and store it up, and it shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him.
Excellent. We've been looking at, last year and this, various stories, the parable of these folks and the parable of this story, and we looked at the creation story, we looked at Adam and Eve in the garden, or Cain and Abel, and now we approach Noah. But I want you to sort of suspend disbelief a bit and think of this story not as an isolated incident or something that we can rip from the headlines and study apart from the rest of the narrative. The Jewish way of approaching a text like this is to essentially go word by word and to see what's in there that we can derive meaning from, as opposed to reading the entire story, if we gave you time to read all 4 of these pages, and then come to some grand conclusion, or then to sum it up as if this is what the story comes to teach. You may remember that last year when we looked at the parables, one of the texts that inspired the course was by Amy Jo Levine, called Short Stories by Jesus, was her introduction to these various parables. Encourages us not to domesticate or to be overly eager to simplify the parable so that it's palatable, or it's digestible, or it's acceptable, or that it's safe, or whatever else it might be. I want you to understand that this story doesn't come to teach any one thing, although we can understand if we look a little bit before what came about, what it's a response to, or why it appears here in the text. But the Jewish way of looking at it is to take apart each little piece. So if you look at just the first line, we're going to be introduced to Noah. We met him a chapter before in a genealogy, so we know where he comes in the family tree. But this is where we're going to get introduced to Noah. So in that first line, we get a description of Noah that's in 3 parts. What do we know about Noah from this verse? What 3 qualities does he possess, Charles? Righteousness.
Blameless in his generation.
Yes, blameless in his generation. And he walks with God. Right? So a classic Jewish approach would be to say, what do each of those mean? They must mean something distinct, one from another, or must gloss something, or else it would be a redundancy and wouldn't be necessary. And so one way to begin to look at it from a Jewish Torah study perspective is to look at each one of those words, or any one of those words that appear. Where else does that word appear? How do we know it? It turns out that just the first word, that Noah was righteous, the word is tzaddik. We have that word shows up a lot in Jewish culture. A tzaddik is considered a righteous individual. Tzedakah, which is our word for, it's loosely translated as charity, but it actually has references to doing that which is just. Not just giving money away, but righting the scales, right? Someone who's righteous. And Noah happens to be the only one in the Torah who has this designation of being righteous. So we might ask, what is it that Noah did that distinguished him from his neighbors? The next one is even more interesting, it seems to me. What does it mean to be blameless in your generation if your generation was the generation of the flood where everyone but this individual gets wiped out, right? And so when we had, when our children were infants, their rooms were festooned with Noah images, right? The happy grandfather on the deck of the ship with all these cute giraffes sticking their necks out of the portholes, and where'd the elephants go, right? Sort of a happy, clappy story for children, but it's really a terrifying, traumatic drama story, right? Where all of everything that breathes life is going to be destroyed, save for those who are secreted safely on the ark. So what does it mean in such a generation to say that Noah, forgive me, I keep making that mistake, that Noah is righteous or blameless in his generation? What does it mean? What's that? Why is it a big deal?
If he stands out so considerably, he's been selected by God.
He's been selected by God. He stands out. Well, so the rabbis ask is it a compliment of significance? Because given that generation, to be righteous in the midst of so many people doing the wrong thing really takes a certain kind of backbone, a certain kind of integrity, a certain kind of courage that we may or may not feel that we have when everyone else is going in this direction to go in the other? Or is it more of a left-handed compliment? He's only better than, he's the best of the lot. It's simply grading on a curve. It's very faint praise. If you're the most well-behaved person in the prison, right? If you're the one person by comparison, right? Do you remember that there's a joke about the rabbi, the priest, who's doing a funeral for a fellow who was really not a good person. People have a lot of difficulty finding anything good to say about this person, but the rabbi gets up there and he knows he needs to say something good about this individual, and he says, well, he wasn't as bad as his brother, right? So that could be Noah in this story also. He's just slightly better, right? But that itself is significant when you're dealing with that. And we're invited to see ourselves in those kinds of descriptions. What does it mean to strive to be righteous? Or what are the qualities of righteousness? Or what does it mean to tack this way when everyone's going that way, right? We also, just to sharpen this, at the last word in the second paragraph, the earth was filled with violence. It's a homophone, the word violence in Hebrew, with the terrorist organization Hamas. This is Hamas. The word for violence is Hamas. Hamas, the terrorist organization, their name comes from an acronym of Arab words that speak of the Islamic resistance, but it's not lost on anybody who knows Semitic languages or appreciates the idea of what one word will suggest about another, that's the word. So rabbis across the world yesterday, on Saturday morning, looking at this particular text, were opining on what it means to have the world filled with violence, or what it means to live in a world with Hamas, and how do we distinguish ourselves from that, or how do we not fall prey to what the rest of a culture is doing. So everyone's doing it, we might tell ourselves, as we go about doing something we wouldn't have done if we were the first ones to do it, or if we knew that everyone was watching, or if we knew that we were held to a higher standard of expectation. And then what does it mean to walk with God? And we want to take a stab at how those three differ. I don't have a definitive answer. This is the way we would approach it if we were sitting around the table studying it as a Torah text. We would talk about what does it mean to be righteous? What does it mean to be blameless? We're using the translations that they have. One is tzaddik, the other is tamim. Tamim means simple, typically, or innocent. That's a kind of word for blameless, in a sense, right? Or humble. He's credited with being humble. It's not the translation, right? But we can look into what is it about Noah using those three words as a jumping off point. So let's start with the second one. You want to jump in, please?
Yeah. One point about those three ideas. There are parallels in our lives today. We're always trying to, how can you see yourself in the story? Deanna, our intern, was preaching today at 8, 9, and 11, and she and I and a physician who's been a doctor for about 30 years were talking, and she's in the phase where she's really good at one thing, preaching, but she doesn't have much experience at all in which way do I turn, or just did her first funeral sermon. That was a really big deal. How many funeral sermons have you done, Jonathan? A lot, a whole lot. The first idea to be a righteous man, a righteous person, you've learned over experience how to do all the basics of your faith, your particular career, pretty well. You've imbibed them over time. You understand the fundamentals of whatever that discipline is. And you've got them. You've not mastered them, but let's say you're an expert. You move on to blameless. You don't even have to think about doing them at a certain point. It's so natural for you to do that. And you understand why this rule is the way it is. You follow all the commandments, and then you understand, why do I follow these commandments? What does that mean? In the second stage, you would say, well, I haven't killed anybody today, but the blameless is, I don't have violence in my heart. When somebody does something wrong to me, I don't immediately want to hit them, and I could get away with it, I would. I let that go. I'm able to understand why they did it, even if it's hurtful. The third phase of walking with God, is Louis Armstrong described, how are you such a good musician? He said, well, you practice, 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 learn the first part, learn all the fundamentals of music, and then you just throw all that away and play. But you can't do that until you spend all the hours practicing and understanding the structure, the theory around it, why you do it. And when you've so taken that in, then you just walk with God. But that it's sequential and you do all three at the same time, but you do have to go from piece to piece for the whole thing to make sense. That's another way. So whatever your discipline is of approaching that I think is probably what that means. Not drawing the only point, the only meaning, but it's a way for us to enter that text. Rabbi?
Thoughts so far? Questions about that? Yeah, please.
On the top ceiling of Vodav Shalom, there's the 3 verses from Micah.
Yes.
And maybe just because there's 3, something like to do justice, to love mercy, to walk with your God.
Lovely.
It made me think of that.
Perfect. So those are the echoes, right? And when we read it in Hebrew, or when we're using a translation, obviously, and a word appears here and a word appears there, there's now an opportunity in rabbinic hermeneutics to say, what is it? There's a fancy Latin phrase. It's called hapex legomenon, and it means a word that only appears once in the text. So how do we translate a word, or how do we give meaning to a word that we have no ability to compare it to? It's a challenge, right? We have to gain meaning from context. So one of the ways to do it is say, so this phrasing of love justice, walk humbly, love mercy, pursue justice, walk humbly with your God, is an echo of this. In much the same way, I was saying, Jonathan and I were sharing just before we came out for the class, that the verbs that are used to describe what God is going to do in unleashing the flood are the same verbs that are used in the creation, but reversed. So it's sort of an uncreating, if you will, right? It's sort of like going to a concert, hearing the music, but if you can appreciate when this is repeated, or when the leitmotif shows up again, or it's now ABC, now it's CBA, right? Different kinds of patterns appear, and that's true in this text also. Why? Because Noah is essentially the start of a new creation. He's the new Adam, as it were, right? If we're going to wipe everything off the earth and start again with a nuclear family, a single nuclear family, so Noah becomes the new Adam. Creation starts anew. Some new rules are provided, and there's certainly an awareness of what had come before. That's the concept here. And this idea of being a new Noah shows up also in Christianity. Yes?
Who's the new Adam?
The new Adam.
The new Noah, the new Moses, Jesus. It's very specific, intentional parallels drawn that, you mean like it was before, and similar, the one who goes through the deluge, the one who delivers us from slavery, liberation, that Jesus is in the line like that to bring about either through baptism or through his crucifixion, resurrection, that brings redemption. So those parallels or echoes are there really across both traditions.
Please.
Could you expound a little more on Torah teaching on walking with God?
Say that.
The question was, can I expound on what it means to walk with God? That idiom, to walk with God, is used in a couple of different places. We're going to see it later with Abraham, that Abraham walks either before God. The preposition is a little bit different, but it suggests, I take it, that one is doing that which is in concert with, or that if God is with you, or you're mindful of that what Noah is doing here is approved. In fact, it says he's found favor in God's sight. What he's doing is pleasing. It's consonant with his belief system, right? And that God is the one who has created this, or God is the one who has decided that Noah and his family get to survive the flood. It has sort of that divine imprimatur, right? Okay. Let's stay with blameless in his age, or blameless in his generation. What does it suggest about how we might understand Noah? Unlike a Jesus figure in the parables, the characters in the Torah are themselves fallible. Or they're not divine characters, right? So what can we learn from the idea that one is blameless in their age or righteous in their generation? What does it suggest to you? Yes, please.
Blame is something that happens when you do something that's wrong, either illegal or immoral,
Okay.
something like that. So I'm trying to work back into it that way.
Okay. So it's pointed out that to be blameless is to be not have done something wrong, right? Whether it's illegal or immoral or whatever lines you've crossed in so behaving, right? To be blameless or to be innocent is not to be guilty of that, right? Yes?
But who sets up what the criteria for blame or blameless? I mean, I can say you're
God.
a good guy and you're blameless, but I have no authority.
Right, so who does?
Or God.
There you go.
But how do we hear from God who's blameless?
Well, the Jewish tradition would tell you, you read that in the text. And the text is essentially, the Torah text, is not only divinely revealed or divinely written, but is one of the metaphors that's used in Jewish tradition that the Torah is a love letter between God and the Jewish people. And if you remember writing letters or receiving amorous expressions of love and affection in a written form, you go back to rereading that, right? We don't, a love letter, we don't read only once. We go back over it and over it again. And so how we know what we know from this text is because God determines that it's so. That's the conceit, right? Just like God created the tree of knowledge or the tree of good and evil, so too is there a divine standard out there, and Noah, certainly in contrast to his neighbors, meets that standard. That's the premise, that God made the rules. You don't like it?
It sounds like we created a good story.
I don't think that's wrong, right? The comment is that we've created a good story. Let's agree that where Genesis tells us in the first and second chapter that human beings have been created in God's image, that the truth of the matter is we have also created God in our image. The way in which we imagine God or the qualities that we ascribe to God are, if you will, one of my professors in rabbinical suggested, we've, the rabbis, made God out to be essentially the rabbi par excellence. If you can master the Torah by reading it over and over, and maybe you've memorized it and you have the deepest of intimate knowledge with this text, good for you, God wrote it. Right? You can argue with it, but God will decide what it actually means, that idea. That the rabbis have projected onto God all of the very best qualities. And we don't do something so very different. If I were to ask you the qualities that God possesses, okay, we'd make a list of what those qualities are. And they're framed in human language and human ability to express ourselves. Moses Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher of the 12th century, introduced a concept called negative theology. And negative theology is the following. He posits that given our human limitations, the fact that we're finite in every dimension except for our desire, our curiosity, our imagination, what we want or yearn for. In every other dimension, we're completely finite, and therefore our ability to say anything about God is going to necessarily fall short and could fall into the realm of blasphemy. So when you say God is good, okay, what do you know about good? How good do you, what's the best you know? And does that limit God? And you say, well, God is love. Okay, I know you've experienced love, you've given and received love, but do you think that's the total of what God is capable of? God is powerful. Okay, so what? You can bench press 250 pounds? What's powerful to you? I've never actually made it.
Used to.
I used to actually imagine I could. Now I know better. Right? But so what do you know about power? What is human power next to God's power? And therefore, if we say God is powerful, God is love, God is whatever it is, that we're saying essentially that which is incorrect or doesn't capture it. You and I appreciate it because it's what we have to work with, and therefore Maimonides suggested in this idea of negative theology is all that we can say about God is what God is not, or there's sort of an implied concession or a qualification. I'm going to now describe God as love, but the love I've experienced is of a human dimension. This is another order, but it's the best I can explain to you about what it means. Does that make sense? So when we say God is good, or Noah is good, or we've created a good story about this God, we've projected onto God in our best of abilities those human qualities that we say, and they're exponentially more. And even that doesn't begin to describe it, right? The other answer I have for you, and then I'll stop, is there's a ditty that says, how odd of God to choose the Jews. And then the rejoinder is, it's not so odd, the Jews chose God. That we create the gods that we imagine. And there are a lot of technologists who are now suggesting that we have created with technology the God we once imagined. If we say that God knows everything, we're getting pretty close to the idea that we've captured the world's knowledge, right? Or that we can know things about each other, or there are entities out there who do because your entire history is available. Or the all-seeing God. Well, we now have to behave in society as if there are cameras watching us all the time, because who knows whether they're not. We've created a world where we have begun to approach, in our own human realm, that which we once reserved for God. And so yes, there's a tension between whether or not this is the story that God wrote for us, or whether we've created the story to explain or to give meaning to our experience. Does that make sense? You want to jump in?
I was going to say, stories, we talked about this a class or two ago. Stories are the best way we have to convey truth and meaning over time, and that's why we continue to tell them, this being one good example. The Christian history has a very parallel idea of we call it the via negativa. God is not. But what has been the Christian answer to that? How do you know what God is like? Think about it. We got his name all over the place and images all over. If you want to know what God is like, God comes through people like Noah and Mary and so on, and prophets and apostles and martyrs. Ultimately, God sends God's Son, his essence, himself, in the form of a human being, because what can a human being know better than another human being? And so that full revelation of God is known through another person. And that's what it means to love, to suffer, to practice forbearance and all those different things. That's how we have expressed that very same idea. So did we project on all this? Sure. We are participants in the process, co-creators with all this. That is generally the Christian response to that. And I'd suggest to you, again, one other thing. Think of this whole story is a way of articulating and putting a point on who is this God that created the world? Who or what is the God we profess to follow that calls us his or her own, that makes us God's people? It's not exactly who the people would have necessarily thought, and that's what the sermon is about today. The God that we got is not necessarily the one that most people want, where we want to make idols. Golden calves are ones we can see or touch, but not ones that we can control, ultimately. That's what it's about, that we can see and touch and feel and so on. But this God is radically different in this particular story in the Scriptures. And we'll get to that maybe today. Go ahead.
Okay. Let me give one more insight. If you look on the next page, just to give some insight, in the third chapter, the third paragraph rather, in the 600th year, you see that one? I'm looking out on the fourth line of that paragraph. It says, on that very same day, Noah with his son, Shem, Ham, Japheth, and Noah's wife, and 3 wives of his sons, entered the ark. The phrase, on that very day, entered the ark because of the flood, on that very day is understood by the rabbis to be this image. Noah's been told that the flood is coming. He's got this much time to build the ark. It's to be of these dimensions and to be filled with the animals in this particular way.
That's about 450 feet long. Football field's 300 feet, so a football field and a half long one dude and his family out of Cyprus. So the guy could literally plant the cypress tree, let it grow up for 50, 80 years, harvest it. This is a long-term commitment that he's got there to be faithful, where everybody's saying, you're an idiot. Why are you doing this? Maybe I misheard 100 years ago the story. And then he finally enters the ark on that day.
So, right, so the image is that Noah is, as it were, standing in the doorway, right? He hasn't yet pulled up the ramp to close the entry to the ark. He's standing there until he feels the waters of the flood begin to hit his head. He's standing in the doorway. He hasn't yet entered the ark until the flood comes, is how this verse is understood by the ancient rabbis, which suggests at least one of two things. Why is he standing in the doorway? Until he actually hears the flood, given that he's been told a flood is coming to build the ark. He's successfully done just as God commanded. That's how the first page concludes. So why would he be standing in the doorway? The question the rabbis ask is, does Noah doubt that God will actually go through with the flood? And until he feels the rain on his head, he's not certain and he doubts God? Or is he at the door of the ark, prepared to go in but not yet in, believing that perhaps the world will change its ways? The unrighteous, the evil people, the violent folks will turn from their evil ways towards God. And Noah never loses faith with his neighbor's ability to change. These are the kinds of questions that aren't resolved, but we're invited to imagine as we stand in our own doorway, or as we hope that people will figure things out, or in a time when there seems to be so much that's in upheaval, upside down, right? Where does our faith lie? Yes, Charles.
From a logistical standpoint, he's standing there with a clipboard checking off everybody as they board.
Right.
But he's organized it in such a way that it happens in 24 hours.
It's pretty amazing.
All of these, a few people,
Repeat
but
that
all
for
these
the-
animals and creatures.
Charles is struck by the fact that he does all these things. He's standing there with a clipboard, checking in all the animals and making sure his wives and his daughters-in-law are aboard, right? And somehow this happens in the course of 24 hours. I'm not sure we have that it says exactly that. I think Jonathan's point is well taken, that we're looking at a longer period of time than the story might suggest, because that's the way in which things develop, or we look back and go, whoa, we've gone crazy as a country. When did that happen? Well, very slowly, then all of a sudden, right? That's sort of how the building of the ark and the coming of the flood, very slowly over the years, and then there's a moment. Yes?
It was a story that, every single civilization has a history of a flood that happened all over the
Oh,
world.
yeah, address that.
Chinese, it was every civilization.
Cross-culturally across the world, there are stories of floods, wiping out civilization, starting anew, or...
Yeah, what's the most famous, other than the Noah one, flood story in ancient literature? Thank you, Charles. For that local history and more, please see Charles to get a tour of the Frick. It's quite worth it. Johnstown flood is what he said. I wasn't referring to that one, though. That's important. The Epic of Gilgamesh, so Babylon, that area, Mesopotamia, which is modern-day what? Iraq. So that's where the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, and by the way, when it refers to eventually where Noah's Ark rested, where is that? Mountains of Ararat, probably referring to far eastern Turkey. So when we talk about a flood, there are multiple flood stories, and this is probably a local adaptation of that. Is there any scientific evidence a flood covered the entire earth? No. Are there floods that covered the Tigris-Euphrates valleys? Yes. And it is not far-fetched to think that's the known world to most of the people. And so all that space, everything we knew, let's just think of it in our way. Imagine, I don't want to pick on anybody, the older you are, say you're 80 years old, how much has America changed since you were a kid? Oh my gosh. I was with Myrnie Berger. I was meeting with her a while, and she was, how old was Myrnie when she?
99.
She was 99, and she died a year ago?
December 8th.
December 8th. how many things changed in Myrnie Berger's lifetime? And not a little bit, it's like a completely different world she entered into. And so in a sense, it's a long-term flood, a washing away of what was, and a new creation that's happening. And so people take these stories, and this, by the way, if you notice, one spot it's 2 animals, pairs, and another one's 7. It's mixing, if you're really interested in the J and the P, Yahwist and priestly traditions, mixing those stories together. It'd be just like you get home and you say, what happened today? And you both tell a story, mom and dad's version, and that gets smushed together into one story. That happens all the time when we do stuff. And so when you see little discrepancies, that's what's happening here. And it's drawing from all these different flood stories. But what is significantly different about this particular Noah story from, say, Gilgamesh is it's not that Noah's the hero and he gets to go off with the gods, or the ship or the ark, which Aaron has a good point about the ark. In Gilgamesh, it's a cube. Here, it's something different. It's why they tell the story. What's the theological point they're making in that, which we will also get to. Again, about God.
Russ?
Rabbi.
I have a book on my shelf by a Jewish author, and I can't remember his name. But he claims, I think echoing Jonathan's point, that the word that we translate as ark is not a boat, it's a box. And I'm wondering if the word later used for ark, later on in Exodus, the box that holds
Yes, we were speaking of this.
the law, is that the same word?
Right. The question, just a sharp. Let me make sure. Let me repeat the question. Let me repeat the question. The question is that Russ is asking is that the word that is translated as ark, the vessel, the boat, right, is in another place referenced as more a box, as opposed to an ark, right? You then ask, is it the same word as the Ark of the Covenant? That's not the same word, right? But the word that's used for ark in this story is called teva. It happens to be the same word that's used for the basket into which baby Moses is placed as he's put in the Nile and then discovered by Pharaoh's daughter. That vessel, or that box, or that for safekeeping.
That boat of deliverance through the water to safety.
Right? So good. So that's a place where the homonym ark in translation gets us to connect. The same thing happens in the Hebrew when we see a word here that's used there. In this case, the teva, the ark into which into which Noah and his family and the animals go, is the same word as that which saved baby Moses. Right? So that's interesting also. We might also point out, I'm going to get you, Michael, we should also point out that creation stories seem to come out of the waters in these cases. Certainly that's the case if you go back and look at the Genesis 1 and 2 story, really the one story, Genesis 1, where creation comes out of the wild and waste, the primordial chaos, and splits the waters, and we come through. Noah is through the waters, creation is destroyed and then rebirthed, as it were. The same thing happened when Moses takes the Israelites through the waters. The idea being, it's almost like a birth canal, or it's almost like a new creation, a new birth as a result of this.
Or the waters of baptism.
Or the waters of baptism.
We have those lines, that very idea he's talking about is referenced in our baptismal liturgy. It's through water where there's a cleansing aspect and there's a birth aspect, and so it has two of those linked, which everybody immediately understands, but it's there within the text.
Beautiful. Yes.
Like,
It seems to me that the question of what it means when it says Noah is righteous, blameless, and walk with God is really explained by the preceding 9 verses of the chapter, where we learn that those were the days when the sons of God mated with the daughters of men and begat heroes. And heroes, so the verse says, earth is filled with violence because of them, filled with violence because of heroic culture. My reading of the Old Testament would be that it is deeply suspicious of heroic culture. If the Greeks had a sacred book, it was the deal is, classical culture was heroicentric in a way that I don't think the Old Testament is.
Say that for the camera.
This is essentially saying that Noah was not governed by heroic values.
Nice. So Michael's pointing out that when the story where we began it says there's violence that filled the earth, we need to understand what happened before these verses. And in the 5th and early verse of the 6th chapter, we get introduced to this idea that the gods in heaven, or the divine messengers from the heavenly realm, mate with the beautiful human women. So they're taken with the human female form and begin to copulate and create these semi-divine beings. They don't actually have any divinity in them, but there's a concern about what it means. And so the commentators talk about, if you read just before that, we get these long lengths of genealogy, how long Methuselah shows up between Adam and Eve and Noah, right? The length of life is described as incredibly long, and then once this happens, once God decides that human beings have really gone astray, or, if you will, in the nice story that we've created, we need a story that dispenses with all of what you're referring to as heroic culture, these creatures that are human and divine, or the product of a human and divine liaison. That's now underwater, right? Or that's now behind us. We break with that, which gives another dimension to what this story is intended to do, to move us by a leap, if you will, beyond that idea. That God calls the shots, but human beings are responsible for our own actions. And no longer do we have the ability, or no longer is there free flow of ideas or emotion between human beings and the divine culture. Right? So this creation story, or this renewal story, or this response to the violence is a break with the past. Okay? Yes?
Keep going.
Oh, keep going. Okay. Let me jump back in. I want to say something about the idea that the human beings that are described, or the characters that are described in these stories, are themselves incredibly human, if you will. That is to say, there's no one in the Torah stories who is divine or is beyond human foibles, whether that's jealousy, whether that's violence, whether that's, it seems to be a precondition or a predisposition of human beings. And the stories over and over are our aspiring to something better, to something more, that we've lost our way and we're going to start anew. And Noah, imperfect, but the best of his generation, or having made errors, or Jonathan, at the end of the story, if you read to the end, how does Noah respond when it's all done? He turns.
The most righteous, good person in his generation escapes the floods, complete destruction. What does he do? The very first thing. I mean, yeah, he has an altar. And then after that, he does what? Plants a vineyard, makes wine from the grapes, and gets blind, fall down drunk. First thing he does. He didn't plant, like wheat or barley or whatever. He plants a vineyard, makes wine, and then gets drunk. And then curses the son who sees him and doesn't cover him up, his shame. That's the best we got, by the way. And here's a key point in the story. From whom are all of us descended? That guy, that family. Yeah, awesome. But the best of his generation, you should think of it that way. So we're all unique and special, just like Noah was. But think of who is the God in this story. It's not a Greek idea of God. And we talk about Greek gods, it's either heroic ones like Michael's referring to, the mighty acts, or often we think of Greek in terms of philosophy as an unmoved mover, omniscient, omnipotent, removed from the creation, the famous clockmaker. You set the world in motion and then step back. This God is fundamentally different from that. What's this God like, according to the story? Pretty involved, yes. Vengeful? How vengeful?
God's very upset with the rest of Noah's generation.
God's upset with the rest of Noah's generation. True. Think of, instead of anger or vengeful, think of, just imagine, if you will, you're a parent. And you have this child that you have given everything to, has all the advantages in the world. And you fed him, you clothed her, you taught her how to ride a bike, taught him how to throw a baseball or whatever. And he fell and hurt his knee. Good job. And then that child completely rebels against you. I hate you. You're stupid. You don't know anything. If that's ever happened to you, like say they became a teenager, how do you feel as a parent? Disappointed. Were you vengeful? Probably not the word that comes to mind. No, your daughter's right two down from you, so be careful what you say.
Until the child reaches its 20s.
Until the child reaches its 20s, yes, that's fair. They can be difficult, challenging. Think of this, the view of God is makes the creation, creates everything that is. And what does God ask of human beings in the story? Be fruitful, multiply, be in relationship with me. And the stories over and over, no, I think I know better than you. In fact, I know better than you, God. I'm looking out for my interest. My brother is pissing me off. I guess I can say that, I'm the rector. My brother's making me angry. I'm going to kill him. Yeah, I know better. And Adam and Eve, well, I know God said we can do anything we want and everything's just great except this one thing. I'm going to do that because I want to know better than God does. Or all these stories are there. I'd rather do it on my own. I don't need you. And if your child said to you or acted that way, I don't need you, what feeling, emotion do you have? Joy with creation? Your son needs a talking to. It's going to be something like that. Heartbroken, betrayed, hurt, crestfallen. Pick your word like that. It's so distanced, so hurtful. This God is intimately involved with creation, with the people, with human beings. This has gone so far, I've got to start over. And I'm going to keep creation, but we got to go back. And does God get rid of all evil? No. Does God get rid of freedom and choices? No. What does God say in the story? How he, she, whatever you prefer, how he will be. I'm going to stay in contact. We're going to start over, but I promise I won't go this way anymore. I won't destroy it. Instead, how, according to Scripture, not just the story, but all of it, how does God choose to be in relationship with you? So, any parent here, I'm going to come down on you like a ton of bricks. You're grounded forever until you're 18, and you will do this and not do that. At a certain point, that doesn't work. And maybe God figured that out. I don't know. We could ask the psychologist, psychiatrist. Instead, what is the approach God uses throughout the Scripture to try to win the love back? And this, if you think of all the Bible as a love letter, what does he do to try to get you back? I'm going to punish you again because that's just what... No. Forgive, yeah, but that's not how it starts. Well, I'm going to send... So these people, Israel, I'll make a covenant with them. I'll make a promise that I never break. That's what a covenant means. I'll put this rainbow in the sky as a reminder. That's a lovely part of the story, to remember this isn't how it's not going to work anymore. In fact, how it will work is, you, Israel, are to be a model to the whole world of how we are in relationship with one another. Again, that's what the sermon is about today. What does it mean to be God's people? God behaves or acts or lives or makes these promises, and we respond, usually not well. And there are prophets and apostles and martyrs and all these stories and the witness of Israel of how we're called to be in relationship. And our version of the story is ultimately God sends God's self, Jesus, to come be with us to show us a better way to be in relationship. That's the story. So no more smiting, which is an underused, fantastic word. No more smiting. It's invitation. Totally different, as Michael points out, from Greek gods or pretty much any other pantheon, mythology of different gods and deities. It is an invitation that we can always reject. But God's part of the deal, the word is covenant, is God won't break his part of the deal. It still stands. Is that consonant with?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
The other thing I would point out, just put a finer point on it, is this is a God who can course correct. This is a God who is in an emotional relationship with, such that there's resentment, or there's disappointment, or there's love. I remember, of course, I took a rabbinical school called God's Anger and God's Love. What does it mean to have a God who emotes? Or what does it mean to suggest that even as Noah walks with God, God walks with Noah? If you're on a walk with someone, right, you may describe what you did by going on a walk with this other person. For the other person, they're describing having gone on a walk with you. So what does it mean for Noah to travel with God? What does it mean for any of us to move through the world with an awareness? Not that this God at a remove, per se, is watching, but that we're in relationship. Right? That in spite of what we do, or because of what we do, we have that covenantal partnership. And ultimately then, it gets down to the idea that the way in which we behave is in our own hands. The way in which we respond to the violence around us, or the way in which we respond to bad behavior in our midst, we might be able to get away with more, but it might be exactly that which encourages us to be better or to be different. And that's what distinguishes Noah from the rest of the people around him.
It's our choice, so it's not God like a little marionette, all the people of the world. Why doesn't God fix this in Israel and Hamas, or Russia and Ukraine, or pick wherever? We have the freedom to do that, and it is our choice to how do we live out this faith in walking with God. Thank you all very much. Happy birthday, Aaron.
Thank you very much. Thank you.